With China asking Apple to remove all of Meta's apps from its App Store, and the USA banning TikTok unless they sell to a non-Chinese entity, we're seeing the impact of government policies on tech companies and how important those companies are for sustainable innovation. According to the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, 137 out of 194 countries have put in place legislation to secure the protection of data and privacy for their citizens. Africa and Asia show a different level of adoption, with only 61% and 57% of countries, respectively, having adopted such legislation. Data and policies go hand in hand, as every country has the right to protect their citizens. But what happens when these policies become unfavorable due to the rising tensions between countries? Join us as we dig deeper into the politics of data and how it affects you.
Hello and welcome to Tech into the Future, where we talk about everything that's happening in technology and how it affects you. My name is Ngozi Madueke-Dozie. I look after Android partnerships for West Africa at Google.
My name is Tomiwa Ladikomo. I'm the CEO of Tech Cabal, a digital publication that's been covering African tech for the last decade. Alongside Ngozi, I'll be your guide into the world of tech in Nigeria, Africa, and the world.
Welcome back to Tech into the Future. We will take you through the headlines. President Biden on Wednesday signed a law that will ban Chinese-owned TikTok unless it is sold within a year. It's an aggressive move that threatens TikTok's future in the USA and intensifies America's tech war with China.
So there's a related thing happening, which is also part of the same trade war, which is on Friday, Apple said it pulled several messaging apps, Meta's WhatsApp and its Threads, from their app stores in China after the Chinese government asked for those apps to be removed, citing security concerns. Now, there have been reports that say that the reason the Chinese government asked for these apps to be removed is because they were things that were considered defaming to the Chinese president. But all of this is part of essentially what is an inflamed sort of trade war with a lot of tip-tack, a lot of back and forth that started with sort of the USA sort of attacking Huawei and has been going on for quite a while now.
Very retaliatory, if you ask me.
Yeah, and I think it's an interesting thing. It's quite dangerous. It's interesting to watch all of this play out because essentially it ends under a period where, from a globalization perspective, every country was really kind of quite certain that they were going to be interdependent. And the US was relatively comfortable with the idea that a lot of their apps, a lot of their sort of products were being built in China, and China would have access to their technologies. And China was quite confident that they could do that and they could trade freely with the US. And what you're seeing is this increasingly protectionist stance from both countries, which will affect us here in Africa because if, China is already talking about developing its own iOSs, its own operating systems. If the interoperability is not there, then you have to decide, well, are we following sort of like whatever line of technology China is going through, or the one America is going through? And so it's interesting to see this war intensify. I don't know that it's necessarily a good thing for global trade. I don't know that's necessarily a good thing for us in Africa. But if we are sharp about it, perhaps there could be opportunities for us.
For us, indeed.
We should be building.
Yes.
In this time.
As we continue to talk about innovation, Meta's new AI assistant has been launched. This was rolled out across WhatsApp, Facebook, Instagram, and Messenger. The assistant can answer questions, create animations, and generate images. The AI tool is Meta's competitor to OpenAI's ChatGPT and Google's Gemini, but in a very unique twist. Meta has also partnered with Google and Microsoft to provide results from both companies' search engines.
So my question here is, have you actually seen this?
I have.
And how do you feel about it?
Well, so if you've updated your WhatsApp, you see it right there, and it says ask, but I think for me is that, well, what am I asking? Like if I'm on WhatsApp, I'm on WhatsApp to chat with somebody. So ask what exactly?
I don't really want a search engine in my conversations.
Exactly. So what I think is happening is that, everyone wants to show how AI integrated they are and how they're using generative AI. I just don't know how well placed it is.
It'll probably evolve. See how it goes. Bringing it down to Africa, TLCon Capital raised a second fund of $154 million to back early stage startups across Africa. It is the third of such funds that big sort of investors have raised for Africa. So Partech raised $300 million, Norskin raised $205 million, and then TLCom with this within the last 6 months. And so I think it's really great sort of signal in terms of availability of capital for the markets. They've already started investing from this fund. They've invested in Seamless HR, Fair Money, Zone, and Vendies. And so, yay for capital in a tough market.
Yes, talk about a little bit of summer in the winter.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, speaking of winter, there's been some other downturns. So Market Force winds down its B2B e-commerce arm. Kenya's B2B e-commerce company, Market Force, is winding down its B2B e-commerce business that served an informal merchant group like the mom and pop stores after a turbulent 2-year period where they scaled down operations quite severely.
It's been a tough period for Market Force, as it has been for quite a few startups. Another one that's recently run into a bit of trouble is The Peer, which is a fintech that shut down semi-recently. In an interesting twist, they're returning capital to their investors.
I know, that's quite nice.
They're returning $350,000 at the end of a run where essentially they just could not find market fit. There's been a lot of conversation about whether the kind of burn that fintechs, the rate of burn, the rate at which they burn through capital is too aggressive, and if that 350K is kind of sufficient in terms of relative to the amount of money invested in the company. But it is an interesting trend it's not a trend, but it is definitely interesting to see a team of founders say, we can't go any further with this.
Yeah.
We're going to wind up shop. We have enough money to pay off everybody and send everybody home, and actually to return some money to the people it is that,
Noble thing to do. We'll be remiss if we didn't mention that Uber and Lagos State have ended their month-long row on real-time data sharing. Mobility giant Uber and Lagos State have reached an agreement ending a month-long row after the government's request to enforce a 2020 deal to share real-time data.
It's a really interesting point, and I think both parties will be happy to see it, but it's also relevant to our conversation today, where we're going to speak about data and how it affects you. Don't go anywhere. This is Tech Into the Future on Arise TV.
Welcome back to Tech Into the Future, where our focus today is on the impact of policies and the politics of data on technology and the technology industry in Nigeria.
So, big tech has been in the eyes of government legislation in the last few months. So if you look at the recent happenings at Apple, Meta, TikTok that we talked about earlier on, you can see the impact of government policy on big tech companies. And while those are global platforms, you have the same thing happening on a more local basis. And we talked a little bit about that with Uber's role with Lagos State in terms of what data do they share with one another.
Right.
And these things have a global cast, but on a local level, how does it affect you if Uber decides to share the data about where you're riding with the government and how many rides a month do you take, or where you are at any given point? Those are the kind of things, and the government will have its reasons for doing this because they want to protect their citizens.
Yeah.
And Uber is going to say, look, based on our policies from back home and on US laws, we're not allowed to share this data. And so there's a lot of compromise, there's a lot of push and pull in terms of this kind of regulation.
I also think you also want to ask, to what extent has Ngozi signed up to letting the government know where she's going because she took an Uber, right? I'm taking an Uber because I don't want to drive, I don't have a car, right? Am I then now subjecting myself to my data being open to anyone knowing my whereabouts just because I don't have a car? So I guess yes, there's a portion of it that is about the company or the entity, but I think it's also that privacy for the person. So the question is, who actually is, who is protecting me, right?
Yeah.
Is it the company or is it the government?
Yeah. So in 2018, Europe launched GDPR, which is a general data protection regulation. And it's their framework for protecting consumer data. In 2019, the Nigerian Information Technology Development Agency, NITDA, adapted that for Nigeria and launched the NDPR. And so today, we're going to be speaking about both of these legislations. If you've ever been on any website, you've seen that little thing that says, accept all cookies, inspect all cookies,
Yes.
accept only some cookies. I don't know if it's made the internet any easier or better to use or my data any more secure, because half the time you just press
Accept all.
that one.
Today's guest was the NDPC's Pioneer National Commissioner. He worked as the Director for E-Government and Development and Regulations at NITDA. Having worked in the public sector for over 30 years, he brings a wealth of experience to today's conversation. Welcome, Dr. Vincent Olatunji.
Good evening. Thank you very much for having me here.
Thank you for being on the show. Now let's kick off and to help our audience by defining a few acronyms. So there's the NDPC, there's the NDPB, and there's the NDPR. If you can help us define those, please, and just tell us what they are and how they're different.
Yeah, thank you. We actually started with the NDPR. That is Nigeria Data Protection Regulation, which was issued under NIDA as a subsidiary legislation to NIDA Act of 2007 on the 25th of January 2019. Looking at what was happening globally then, that all countries are putting in place measures to protect the interests, freedom and rights of their citizens. We felt that we needed to do something urgently in Nigeria, having looked at what various government predecessors have done in the area of mentioning the need to protect the personal data of our citizens. But the foundation is actually in our Constitution of 1999, specifically Section 37 of 1999 Constitution as amended. So we derive the power to issue that regulation from that part of the Constitution, and Section 6C of NIDA Act of 2007 that actually empowers in that to issue subsidiary legislation. So because we didn't have a law then in the area of data privacy, that was why we issued that regulation. And what we did was to immediately set up a committee to ensure proper implementation. Because one thing for you to have a regulation, it's a completely different thing for you to put in place measures and institutional framework for implementation. So a committee was set up to implement the NDPR then, which was the Nigeria Data Protection Regulation then. And looking at the kind of traction that we gained within 1.5 years, looking at what was happening globally then, that the appropriate thing was for Nigeria as a country of over 220 million people to have a major law, for a principal law for data privacy and protection in Nigeria, and also for Nigeria to have an independent commission or agency of government to properly implement the law. Because there were so many challenges, so many things that we couldn't deal with the regulation, and more importantly that we were under NIDA then. So a recommendation was made to the former President Muhammadu Buhari, that the trend globally will be for countries to have their principal laws and have their dependent data protection authority. So through a presidential directive, the former president now created the Nigeria Data Protection Bureau, which was the NDPB, to properly take over the implementation of the NDPR from NIDA. So the bureau was actually created out of NIDA. And part of what we were to do was, one, ensure proper implementation of the regulation. and in order to provide the rights and freedom of Nigerians, and to also improve the global competitiveness of our businesses. And in addition to that, we are to develop a principal law for data privacy and protection in Nigeria. And we're working with all stakeholders, and to the glory of God, within 9 months, we're able to develop a principal law, which is now the Nigeria Data Protection Act, signed by President Bola Ahmed Tinubu on the 12th of June 2023. So the law actually now created a commission. So the Bureau, NDPB then, now transitioned to an independent Data Protection Commission. So this is how we were able to get from NDPR, which was the regulation then, the Nigeria Data Protection Regulation, leading to the creation of the Bureau, Nigeria Data Protection Bureau, by the former president, and now having a principal act on data protection in Nigeria, which now created the Nigeria Data Protection Commission. So the Nigeria Data Protection Bureau actually transitioned to the commission through the law signed by Mr. President on the 12th of June 2023.
Okay, thank you. That is quite the journey, or regulatory journey. I guess let's make it practical for our audience. In translating the law from the GDPR, which is Europe's sort of version, and what kicked off sort of a new sort of raft of data protection legislation, and bringing it to Nigeria, what were the things that you were considering? What were the considerations for localizing GDPR for Nigeria? So in coming up with the NDPR, what kind of changes did we want to make to what it is that Europe did versus what was required locally?
I think globally, the GDPR is respected as the global standard because about 27 countries came together to agree that they should have a regulation to guide the collection and process of personal data of their citizens. And a lot of countries globally are now drawing from what they've done with the GDPR. When we started in Nigeria, we looked at our peculiarities in the country. What works in the EU, can it work in Nigeria? That is one thing that we really need to consider. And we have to be realistic with ourselves that, yes, the level of development in those EU countries is far ahead of what we have here in terms of access to digital technologies where you share your personal data, in terms of the level of literacy for our people in Nigeria. Nigeria is a country where over 65% of the population live in rural communities. Are they able to read and write and properly understand the law they are trying to put in place? And looking at that population, this is a country of about over 220 million people. How do we want to ensure that wherever they are all over the world, that their personal data is adequately protected? Those are the things that we probably evaluated to bring up our own law. Then we did a proper evaluation of the GDPR and look at what works for us and what would not work for us as a country. For instance, when we issued the GDPR, there was nothing like a competition for data subjects when their personal data is breached. Nothing like that in the NDPR. In addition to that, the power to actually enforce the law was with NIDA then, and a lot of people come out to say NIDA would not be able to properly enforce a data protection law. And that was part of what actually led to the creation of the Bureau under the former president. And in terms of penalties, we looked at all these things. And even in the area of basis for processing of personal data, we recall that in the IDPR, we didn't have any like legitimate interest. Whereas in the GDPR, and most of other countries, they have legitimate interest. But in the law that we have now, we have legitimate interest, but with the caveat that whatever you want to do as a data controller or processor under legitimate interest must not override other interests, other bases that have been mentioned before looking at legitimate interest. So these are the things that we look. But the most important thing is how to ensure that in terms of territorial scope, that is, where are we looking at for us to be able to enforce this law? And our territorial scope is very wide. We are looking at data controllers or processors, residents in domicile in Nigeria, and processing data of Nigerians. Also, if you're a data processor or controller, domicile outside Nigeria, but you process the data of Nigerians that are here, for example, the multinationals that have their offices all over the world, who don't really have physical office in Nigeria, that collect and process the data of Nigerians. How do you want to bring them under scope? And that is why that part of territorial scope was expanded to include data controllers and processors that are not domiciled in the country. And also in terms of your data processing activities under the scope too, what kind of data are we talking about? Are we looking at records? In most laws, you have digital data, but now we are looking at different files, records that you have, which is very predominant in a lot of organizations in the country. So these are things that we try to probably look at: our culture, our environment, level of literacy, those who have access to digital technologies before we brought up that law. And we were lucky that when we were developing the law, we had the support of the World Bank. We had a consultant from one of the EU countries, especially from Switzerland. By the time we started with him, we had to properly evaluate what he proposed to us, what their team proposed to us. There's quite a lot of things that we discovered that will not work in this country. And we told them this will not work in Nigeria. We understand our system. We understand our peculiarities. We understand our culture. We understand our people. And that was why we were able to tweak the GDPR to pick what we think will work for us there and bring in our own peculiarities in a way that law will be able to work for us in the country. And that was why it brought us to where we now have an Act of Parliament. And before it even became an Act of Parliament, we involved a lot of stakeholders, right from the ideation stage to drafting, workshopping with a lot of stakeholders from the private sector, public sector, multinationals, development partners, to ensure that we tap from everybody. And we subjected to a thorough review by all these stakeholders before it went to a national validation workshop where we now brought everybody together into one room to look at what we've done. Right. We also gave the opportunity for people to make inputs for like 1 month before it went to the Federal Executive Council, where all the ministers were seated and we shared with them before it went to the National Assembly as an executive bill. So a lot of work went to it, and we consider our peculiarity in the country.
Thank you, sir, for such a history. One of the things you mentioned is actually very important. One of the things that you mentioned as very important was the fact that it is beyond just digital data, right? Talking about the literacy rates, etc., in the country and all the differences between the EU and Nigeria. So that's fascinating. I'm curious, over the last 2 years, what would you say has been the major impact of NDPC and the Bureau?
Yeah, a lot, in the sense that Nigerians now know that they have a right, they have some rights when their data is being collected and to be processed by any data controller. Through the awareness that we are creating, to a large extent, a lot of people now know that before you give out your data, you need to probably understand why they want to collect such data and how they want to process it, where they want to share it to, how they want to store it, what kind of security measures are they putting in place to ensure adequate protection of the data. Then on the part of data controllers and processors, the issue of accountability, which a lot of them never thought of before, is now coming to bear that if you collect anybody's data, you are accountable for the data in your possession to ensure that you put in place adequate technical and organizational measures to protect such data. And this speaks to the issues of doing business, confidence and trust in people doing digital business in Nigeria. A lot of countries now, when you don't have your law and your independent data protection authority, they're not really to do business with you. But now, we have a law that when you carry out any digital transaction that involves the sharing of your personal data, where you leave your digital footprints, you have a confidence that that transaction will go on smoothly without any issue. Now, if there are issues, more importantly with your personal data, there's a law that can protect you, and you have an independent data protection authority that you can go to for recourse. In addition to that, I don't know if you are aware of what most of digital lending companies are doing in Nigeria, where they give out loans to, I call the people economically vulnerable people. And if you default once or twice, they start circulating your information, your images, as maybe you're a criminal, this fellow, some business with him. Now we really went out for some of them. In fact, the Arrowhead, we actually took some of the officials up, and we are collaborating with a lot of organizations to ensure that we properly regulate and control what they are doing in Nigeria. And that led to having a national committee of regulators, where you have the NDPC, you have the FCCPC, you have CBN, you have NCC, NIDA, Nigeria Police, ICPC, looking at various mandates of all these organizations, and we're able to really probably streamline what they are doing. And their menace, to a large extent, has reduced in Nigeria, because before you can actually go into digital lending business now, you have to register with FCCP. When before the accreditation, they will send it to us to ensure that we go through your privacy policy properly, that what you are doing is in line with the law.
Thank you, Dr. Vincent, for joining us this evening. Don't go anywhere. This is Tech into the Future on Arise News.
Welcome back to Tech into the Future, where we just had an interview with Dr. Vincent Olatunji, who is the commissioner at NDPC. Tell me, what were your thoughts? So first of all, I think that it's interesting, when you think of from the bigger context, we're not the only ones, and when I say we, I mean Nigeria, we're not the only ones having the data conversation, right? This is clearly something that, even from our headlines, you talk about, China and the US, everybody's having a data conversation, and there is a lot of politics around that, that's for sure. I think for me, what is interesting is that, first of all, we are having those conversations, which is a good thing. It's also interesting to see that we didn't just take the GDPR, we took it and attempted to localize it. And so that's also very important. I think the last thing I thought was also interesting was that it's not just digital data, right? When you consider that half of Nigeria is not digital, then the data protection cannot just be about digital data, it's about all your data. And I think that's also why there is a very, I want to say, there's an offline and online version of it when you talk about like the controllers, etc. So I feel like from the data collecting and gathering to the data protection, one of the challenges that we face or we're trying to solve for is that there is the data protection offline and there's the data protection for online data.
I think definitely critical points. I have the sense that there definitely is more work to be done.
Yeah.
It's good and important that we're having the conversations, but it does look like there's still a lot of capacity building that's happening at the Bureau.
So he talked about specific incidences of, people taking loans, and then, you have these loan sharks that send out your data, etc. I think one thing that we didn't get to ask was, but how does this coalition of NDPC and NITA and EFCC and FCCPC and everybody, CBN, et cetera, how do they work with the private sector, right? In terms of understanding and then co-creating policies, because it's one thing for private businesses to go about their business, and then you come and the way we do, we come and we just clamp down and we say stop business. You have violated a policy, and it's like, well, if we had worked together, then perhaps we could have co-created policies that would achieve both things. It would allow businesses to thrive, and it would give the regulators the ability to protect their citizens.
Yeah, no, I think there's definitely work to be done, but it was great to have Dr. Vincent talk to us about the work that the NDPC is doing in terms of protecting Nigeria's data. Thank you for joining us today on Tech into the Future. My name is Tomiwa Ladikomo.
And I'm Ngozi Maduka-Dozie. Join us next time as we take you into the business and impact of technology in Africa, how it's changing the world and how it's changing your world. Stay tuned for Arise News.